Hello, everyone. Let's get started. So, welcome, Gustav. Welcome, everybody, to this research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. My name is Joe Roussos, and I'm going to be chairing today. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our guest, Eri Bertsou, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. But she received her PhD in government at the London School of Economics in 2016. And Eri's work focuses on political behavior and comparative politics. She's interested in studying societal challenges to democratic systems, in particular, citizen attitudes towards experts, technocratic politics, rising political distrust, populism, and democratic backsliding. And recently, or maybe not so recently anymore, she received the Eccellenza Professorial Grant, starting grant for the project Varieties of Expertise from the Swiss National Foundation. And I believe that's what we're going to be hearing a bit about today in this presentation. So we're very happy to have you here. Welcome. This seminar is a hybrid seminar, so we have an online audience and an audience in the room. And for people in the audience, remember that we'll do our Q&A afterwards. If you have a very pressing question of clarification, you can flag that to me, but otherwise hold your questions to the end. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time at the Institute for Future Studies. And as Joe mentioned, this is a presentation of the project that was funded by the Swiss National Foundation called Varieties of Expertise, and essentially some of the findings of our first data collection phase that I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts, inputs, and questions. The project in general focuses on expertise, but from the citizen's perspective. So specifically for today, I'd like to talk to you about what we've heard from citizens about what they consider to be politically legitimate uses of expertise. I'm going to start by a little bit of a broader picture. Guilty as charged, I am a political scientist, so if at some point I go too much into my own little enclave of political science terminology, please feel free to stop me. But I very much like this exchange of ideas across narrow disciplinary lines. I'm going to speak a little bit more about this first research question. It's a 5-year project, now 4 years remaining, that focuses on citizens' understanding of independent expertise. Speak about the theoretical approach, or at least what we were hoping to map out theoretically. The empirical strategy, which in this case was getting people to speak and us observing them and hearing their conversations through focus groups, and some preliminary findings. So the overall project and motivation came about after the fact that I'd been studying why some people, and people that I personally knew in countries that had technocratic, let's say, interruptions to their democratic political system, seemed not to be too upset about that. Seemed a little bit upset, but at the same time kind of positive. So after the financial crisis, I started studying with other colleagues this technocratic governments that were placed in certain countries of the European South, but also not just the European South, technocratic politics in general, and citizen attitudes towards technocrats or experts. At the same time, it seemed that governments were facing more and more complex issues and problems. The financial crisis might have been a little motivation for me at that time in my career, but at the same time, the climate crisis, energy transition, all other financial crises in an interconnected global world, not to mention COVID and the pandemic. We also saw that people's views actually do matter, have a really big impact in terms of their willingness to comply with policy and support decisions, especially during the pandemic. Trust in the actors that were making these decisions, in the experts or the bodies that were making policy recommendation and mandates, was a very big predictor of compliance. The perception of legitimacy that people had of these actors had real behavioral consequences. And overall, not for, of course, everyone, the same trust and the same perceived legitimacy. So it seemed, empirically at least, looking at the world, that there was this paradox, this puzzle of increasing public demand. It's like, yes, we need more experts. We need people that know what they're doing. We need people who are aware of the complexities and are able to solve efficiently and effectively these complex, in some cases, existential crises that we're facing. And at the same time, a backlash, almost a denigration of expertise by also some political actors, in general, forces that were colliding in that sense. So the aim of this project was to investigate citizens' views and try to square that puzzle, to this tension. Try to identify how, if at all, experts can be involved in processes that increase people's perceived legitimacy and trust in the political process and in the outcomes. So there's this double effort, hopefully, that we would be able also to uncover if there is particular ways that people find more legitimate and will trust more to see experts involved in political processes. So a few just empirical facts I'll throw at you. This is the latest wave of data collection from the World Values Survey, a very, very large data collection effort done, I think, 194 countries globally. Oh, there we are. Yes, good. So this is my political scientist saying, okay, we don't have to explain what World Values Survey. World Values Survey, from its infancy, included an item saying, how good do you think the following way of governing your country is? Having experts, not government, make decisions according to what you think is best for the country. And here you see the seventh wave is between 2014 and 2020, so it's before the pandemic. And even in countries such as the UK, the US, Netherlands, this is the 50%. I'm not sure if it's very, very clear in the graph, but a lot of like large majorities in many countries respond favorably that it's a good, very good or fairly good way of governing this country. And looking at the data, because we are able to go back, I think, to the late 80s, this has been increasing. We also find, this is of some of the work that I've been involved trying to study this people with technocratic attitudes amongst the citizenry, that almost most citizens agree with statements such as the problems facing my country require experts to solve them, or that leaders of my country should be more educated, more knowledgeable, skilled than ordinary citizens. This is the 4 questions that we created to measure the need for science and expertise in politics. They are measured on a 1 to 7 point scale, with 4 being the midpoint. And as you can see, this is just a cluster analysis grouping together different kinds of people depending on their pattern of responses. Everybody's above the midpoint. We find that people that we would describe as technocratic minded or populist minded, even those with strong party democratic beliefs, everybody is positive on this need for science and expertise in politics.
So could you explain what the different colors are?
Yes, so this is a cluster plot from latent class analysis that groups together the different kinds of people. So the red are the technocratic people, because they score very high on expertise, high on anti-politics, the highest elitist, they're kind of elitist, and lowest scores on populist items. The gray ones are populists. That was one of the surprising findings that has been replicated in almost every study on technocratic and populist attitudes. Populists love experts. they love experts. They want experts. So that was also one of the things. Like, these people don't have the same experts in mind, most probably. Something to figure out. The green one is the party democratic ones, separated by their low anti-politics, so pluralism, embrace for party politics.
Democratic, what is that?
Sorry?
What is party democratic?
There are people who follow Dahl, kind of polyarchy, pluralism, competition of political competition through political parties and the likes. And then we have also, I mean, we're studying people, so we have the people that pick 4 in every category. It's about 3-4% of our sample, but they exist. The average ones. So we have all sorts of people, obviously, in our online surveys. But these are the ideal, let's say, types of technocratic, populist, and party democratic. This is a study that has been published already, measuring technocratic attitudes and populist attitudes in the population. It's in the American Journal of Political Science. This instead is also from a conjoint experiment, so experimentally through a survey, hypothetical scenarios, trying to see, okay, perhaps there's more space for experts. It's not a blanket statement, let's just give everything to experts. So trying to qualify this. And what we do see is that experts are preferred in the policy design, which is the first bracket. Perhaps it's not very visible. So policy design and implementation phases of a policy decision. This is the decision making, so the most challenging step, where there is no difference between the policy decision being allocated to nationally elected representatives or to experts. So there is a null effect, and also this significant difference there. So even that seems there is something going on. Definitely, we also tried to ask specifically for policy scenarios, they are hypothetical, of course, that pertain to different policy areas. That are more like economic policy, taxation, LGBTQ rights, so social policy, counter-terrorism, and environmental policy, so climate change-related environmental policy. And we always find this preference at the policy and implementation stage. And for environmental policy, we even find a preference for experts at the decision-making stage. And that's European countries only, 9 European countries.
Can you say something about the EU institutions?
I don't know what to say, as it doesn't look good for them. It's again, across the board, EU institutions less preferred than national representative institutions. We didn't find in any country, I believe, at any policy field, EU. Yes, so if you are an EU scholar, something to consider.
But the experts are national experts, international experts?
Yes, no. So this is a small conjoint embedded in a survey. It's hypothetical, and it's a team of selected experts at the national level. That, of course, creates some problems. Who are these experts? Talking about experts in general is something that we need to keep in mind, because, as you said again, a committee that might be associated to the UN, to the European Union, is perceived first and foremost through that prism rather than their expertise. So this is some of the previous work, or some of the empirical evidence that I've motivated me, at least, to further delve into what is going on. And the project has 3 aims. What do people consider to be legitimate uses, or politically legitimate uses of expertise? And do they all agree? Or do their evaluations regarding legitimacy and regarding who is an expert vary in a systematic way in society? What drives citizens, or some citizens, to demand more power in the hands of experts? Here in particular, we are concerned with is it a real demand for experts, or is it just increased distrust in the existing institutions, people, politicians, parties? So is it the fact that what we currently have is not working, that anything would be better? And finally, that last step that I spoke about, how do people want to see, if at all, experts or expertise incorporated in political decision making? We can think of some institutional design, be a little bit more creative. We can find policy questions where it's more acceptable, and areas where we should stay clear of. And if, at least looking at the political science literature, the novel approach here is the focus on citizens, because we study a lot about scientific advice or expert advice, how it is incorporated also from a theoretical point of view, how it should, but we don't necessarily know if citizens reason in the same way or follow the same understanding of how political systems work. And after the focus groups, it was blatantly obvious to me that almost all the citizens we included in our study didn't quite know how or how much or whether at all expertise was involved in their political process. So, and I don't blame them. I mean, I'm a political scientist and I'm still figuring it out. So it's not something that's very visible, apart from very obvious cases of COVID or technocratic cabinet appointments. Yeah.
You say support for outcomes as a novel approach. But the questions you ask seem to be more about the input of the process.
Sorry, the
You say the novel approach is one of what you meant with support for outcomes. So that was a novel approach.
well, the idea.
So those seem to be more about the input side rather than the output side.
Yeah, well, it's the output side in the sense that, well, if there is more perceived legitimacy, there will be more compliance and more trust. And so we are interested in some of the dependent variables instead of epistemologically correct policy shifts to perception of legitimacy, willingness to trust the decision, willingness to comply with that decision. So it just shifts the focus from, okay, is this the sound scientific advice that, or the expert advice that is needed at the point?
If you're satisfied with the governance.
Yes, but this would also come as a perceived legitimacy and trust. If it's gone terribly wrong, is unlikely to be high. And the second thing is this idea that where the whole title comes from, this variety, that also I wanted to step away from thinking of expertise as a monolithic thing. Okay, this is what an expert is, this is what expertise is. And open up the door to the possibility of relative understandings, subjective understandings, both from the viewpoint of citizens, but also in the way that it is incorporated in political systems, depending on the different roles, the different policy areas, so there's not just one blanket way that experts need to be involved or called into a process, but think more creatively. So for the theoretical approach, we have these three guiding questions, at least for the first part of the research phase. What do citizens consider to be politically legitimate uses of expertise? Who is assessed as an independent expert? What are the most contested criteria? Can we find these kind of variation in the assessment and evaluation of expertise? And do overall people agree in their assessment of expertise and of legitimacy, or the amount of power experts should have? Or can we observe this systematic difference among groups based on, in our case, we used education as a socioeconomic kind of criteria for separating the groups. The reason for that was mainly the social cleavage theory, so the original theory of social cleavages by Lipset and Rocken from the 60s that kind of described how society is structured in and eventually political competition in European Western context is described by these social cleavages, center versus periphery, state versus church, and the more recent new cleavage, let's say, theory by a lot of colleagues that are delineating new social groups that matter, such as I think Creasy et al. Call them the winners and losers of globalization. Again, education has a big role in there. Or particularism versus more global approaches. Our colleagues in Zurich, Celia Hauserman and colleagues. So this, again, a clear marker, higher education versus lower education groups. So what was an expectation, is I think still to some extent, an expectation to observe either against expertise attitude, sort of a clear distinction in perceptions of legitimacy between these two groups, following education levels or cosmopolitanism, and or perhaps a different way in which they evaluate, they assess who is an expert. So depending on the graph that I showed you, everybody seems to agree we need experts, but choosing and visualizing and imagining very different kinds of people. So as expert profiles. Further interested, and that's a slightly alternative approach, is the motivated reasoning sort of bias that people might have when evaluating the legitimacy or expert level or trustworthiness of an expert based on pre-existing held beliefs. Or if you're more a sociologist friend, social identity theory, meaning that we expect to find people's evaluation of expertise to be influenced by the affiliation or characteristics of that expert, the positions that they are likely to espouse. So if the affiliations and characteristics of that expert place them in an in-group, or in an out-group, let's start, like are against pre-existing held beliefs or group affiliations, then there will be a lower evaluation of expert status and obviously of willingness to engage in a political decision. If, on the other hand, it's an in-group, their evaluations will be higher. Finally, this is a comparative project, and there is a lot of country differences that I find very interesting to explore further, both from a cultural point of view and an institutional point of view. So some initial predictions that has already been shown somewhat in the literature is that distrust in existing politics and existing political institutions generally plays a big role for how willing are people to tolerate more power to be given to other actors, also experts. So we expect that to be associated to stronger preferences for expert involvement in politics. We also expected, not quite sure whether we're going to find that principles of egalitarianism, or reflecting the social structure of societies, would emphasize different criteria in their evaluation of expertise. We have 4 countries that are Italy, the UK, Switzerland, and Sweden. And in this case, we expected the sort of emphasis on so less hierarchically structured societies might, such as Sweden and Switzerland, might have more value for lived experience, less emphasis on educational credentials and the likes. And of course, comparative political institutions. Switzerland, famously the bastion of direct democracy and citizen involvement, highly unlikely to endorse high legitimacy for experts. Italy has had a lot of experience with technocratic inputs, technocratic decision making in its recent and not so recent past, usually associated with stronger legitimacy. They're more familiar with it. Whereas majoritarian political institutions, such as in the UK, perhaps would lead to a more to higher acceptance of expertise that comes with political affiliations. So this idea that everybody, drums their own drum and supports a team. So, methodological approach, as I said, for this phase is qualitative evidence only. So brace yourselves for some evidence that is of small n and rather confusing at the moment. As I mentioned, it's a comparative study. These are 4 countries. They were chosen precisely for this variation in political trust, political culture, institutions, experience with technocratic governance. We ran 6 focus groups in every country between March and late May, June, I would say June this year, which included 6 to 7 participants. They were online discussions to be able to have people from different, geographically a little bit more diverse regions. They lasted an hour and a half. And they were grouped mainly based on their educational level to that point. So we were aiming for low, medium, high levels. Of course, they don't realize that it's not very easy to delineate. Every country has a very different system. Obviously, lower or the educations with the participants with fewer educational credentials were much more harder to contact, and so, or they're much harder to find. Younger, for example, lower educated were impossible to find in some cases. So we went for more practical education as opposed to more theoretical education, and we tried to come up with degrees of separation in that way. And we also grouped them by age, younger versus older, just to facilitate discussion, not for a particular reason. They had all groups followed the same discussion guide. However, in one part, discussed 2 different topics. Half of them discussed an environmental policy scenario, where they had to come up with what an expert committee would look like, what kind of experts they would like to see. Then we presented them with expert profiles that they had to evaluate and rank, and this was specific to either a CO2 emissions tax, or in the economic policy, a pension reform. We're going for hard topics, controversial, not easy, topics that would generate, that are things that people are likely to have thought about or encountered in their lives in the way they consume media, and that would facilitate discussion. And we had some expectations also about the different discourses, thinking that environmental policy might be more expert prone, that has to do with CO2 emissions, whereas economic policy with pension reform, much more redistributive, much more closer to representative interests, let's say. And they all included a ranking exercise of expert profiles, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. Great. So this was the process, the discussion guide. We started by talking about this idea of legitimacy or support for experts. We actually gave them a survey question to see and asked them to answer, like the sort of survey questions that appear in those WVS or other survey questions, and then asked them to discuss their answers, where we really understood that everybody's really understanding survey questions in a very different way. So I don't have the results for that. I think that's a different presentation and paper on its own. So obviously the contextual and personal differences on how people understand I would like decisions to be taken by experts in my country. Then we moved on to a policy scenario, either economic or environmental, as I mentioned, where we asked people to imagine, like, what sort of experts, what are the traits, who would they like to see, and then followed by the pre-generated profiles that we gave them to evaluate, and asked them to rank, and of course to afterwards discuss and explain why they assessed, they evaluated, and ranked the way they did. Finally, hard test for decision making. If that expert team of experts would have some legitimacy to make decisions, and then we concluded with obviously some debrief. So the aims now, obviously, we have a lot to do still. There's a lot of content, but we have already begun with a thematic analysis of the traits, of the criteria used, as trying to figure out the typology of expertise from the citizen's perspective. Studying the evaluations of the different profiles, compare the responses between social groups, and also compare the responses between individuals within the groups. Something that needs to be done. And of course, we have country comparisons overall. So, if I still have your attention, this is where we start discussing about the findings of what did people tell us in Sweden, Italy, the UK, and Switzerland about experts. I'm starting with Italy because I think it's the most fascinating of these countries, and also it helps set the contrast, set the stage for the other findings. I don't know if it's surprising to you or not, but in general, very high legitimacy. Some of the quotes I pulled, you'll see them here, because they will make better decisions for society. So better decisions, effectiveness, epistemologically sound, not politically motivated, immediately in a contrast with what is currently available to the citizen. Even if it's unpopular, maybe they are greater for the long term. This is like the definition of a technocratic minded response. Long-term betterment of the entire society, even if currently unpopular, even if the populist tells you exactly the opposite, and not politically motivated, not because of partisan ideological interests. The politician needs to be an integral part of the decision-making process. Like, this is a democracy, right? But if we are talking about the politicians in Italy of the past few years, with a very low level of quality, better give more power to experts. Also this idea, yes?
A quick question, clarification. Is this your interpretation of the answer, or did you ask like the question, do you find this legitimate? Or what was the question asked? Or is it like to take this out and then you interpret them as being about legitimacy?
This was the question of, after the survey question that we gave them, how much involvement would you like to, the question was, political decisions in my country need to be taken by experts. And they had a 1 to 4. And then there was a discussion, why did you pick 3? Or I picked 2, because so and so. And at the point of discussion, that's the beauty also of the focus group, there's not a direct question to each and every one. There's that initial stimulus, and then the discussion sets off. So I find it's about legitimacy in the sense of, would you accept decisions being exactly. Yes. Finally, this last quote is the exact opposite of what we consider to be the proper division of labor. So the role of the politician is to select the right expert, and the expert can make the decision based on their expertise. So it's or maybe it isn't exactly. So maybe it makes perfect sense. So it's very high levels of perceived legitimacy comparatively. of course, it's not an let's throw everything out, let the experts march in. It's always an understanding that what we have currently is not working. Let's figure out a way that we bring more of expertise in. Less quotes here, but in the UK, we found much more mixed evidence. So we had some of these voices, but also the very, very much no way, experts are not elected, so it's a clear no. It was very much contested. The idea that all opinions need to be represented, and so there shouldn't. It's just not legitimate. It's not perceived as a legitimate way of making decisions. But there were both, especially when it came to, or not because it was motivated by discussion of Brexit, but when someone would, when a participant would veer closer to higher, allowing like our perception of legitimacy, they would say, as we said we saw during the Brexit referendum or the Brexit process, perhaps we needed some more. So it was interesting that this kept coming up. In Switzerland, low, I would say, and medium, because it was a clear no, sound and clear, like loud and clear, for decision making. So decisions in Switzerland need to rest with the people, and it's more acceptable and more expected in the involvement and the wish that experts or that the people that are making political decisions are experts in their field in that sense. Similarly for Sweden, which is low and high at the same time, in that there's a very unequivocal no for decision making. Again, no room, no conditions, shouldn't under any circumstances, but a very clear, again, unanimous yes for advice, for involvement, for incorporation, and very high trust if decision making stays with politicians. So a little bit probably what you have today. Moving on to the trades. This was not groundbreaking. I'm probably not going to tell you something you did not expect. People reason very much the same way that we theorize about expertise. So knowledge, someone that has knowledge in their field, specific expert knowledge. The interesting thing is the discourse around knowledge, that it has two variations. One being knowledge of the problem, of the complexities, of the issue at hand, that usually goes hand in hand with having higher education or having spent years analyzing and studying and working with that problem. And then knowledge of the realities faced by ordinary people, which is a slightly different way of conceptualizing knowledge, to know what it's like to live the reality. Education, again, this we can split into kind of the theoretical knowledge or credentials achieved through educational attainment versus the lived experience, versus people that live, that there is some expertise in the everyday lived experience of people. The classical is the doctor, the nurse, the surgeon, versus the or perhaps the nurse or someone that has worked around hospitals for 25 years, around doctors. Educational credentials are also a very contested point in some cases, because and they're a way to spring this to kind of motivate this discussion around education. For example, in Italy, in some cases, they would comment on you just cannot have someone with a diploma or not a university degree in a world where we all have to have 2 degrees. It's just not, it doesn't reach that level of expertise. Sweden was also similar in that respect. Educational credentials were valued very much. But that doesn't mean that the other kind of knowledge was discarded. It was just considered a different type, because it is through lived experience that the only way someone gets their hands dirty, they roll up their sleeve and have actual knowledge of what is going on in the real world. Professional experience, again, a clear trait. Track record, something we didn't at least incorporate in our study so far, but I think it's very important how people evaluate what has that person done before, what sort of advice have they given before, how well did it work. Sounds very reasonable. And the most contested criterion perhaps was this idea of independence and whether it is or it is not a dimension of expertise. The idea that if there is a clear position, a clear side, belief of that expert, association, affiliation, does that discard, does that take away from their expertise, from their levels of expertise perceived, or is it just another dimension where people evaluate separately? Okay, are they an expert? Do I like their position? Or do the two fuse together? And we created the profiles also to evaluate that discussion. So I think this idea of independence was very diffuse in the discussions that came before we presented them with the profiles I'm about to show you. But of course, after, when it's easy to talk about experts in the abstract, but when you're faced with the expert, the politician, a specific profile, then you can start picking things and it all starts to unravel. So there is, on the one hand, the idea that the expert that is partisan is less valid, is less of an expert. And then at the same time, even within the same individual, saying, yeah, but everyone has a little bit of a political tendency, everybody has their own position, so is it just better that we know it up front? Or that, what does it mean if someone looks independent? Are they really independent? So does it even exist, independence? We also probed this idea of an activist. We have an activist profile in the experts. And in some cases, we try to make it very, very strong. And people, usually of the opposing side, are like, that should disqualify you. That you shouldn't even be in the running of an expert committee if you are an activist. In this case, for a profile I'm about to show you, where the expert was affiliated to Extinction Rebellion. It's a very, very active and yeah, a little bit disruptive, I would say, association. On the other hand, the same profile that was evaluated by people that were more on the side of let's do something about climate, it's the only way they can affect change. It actually shows your passion about it. It doesn't disqualify you at all. So this idea already of motivated reasoning of, okay, if I agree with the already, if the expert shares my pre-existing stance, my pre-existing belief, then I incorporate that in my evaluation of the profile. Finally, something that I was a little bit surprised by, and that it came up in every country and pretty much in every group, this idea of, even when talking about expertise, politics is politics. And it's all about interest representation. So for citizens, it's impossible to separate the two. What I mean here is that even when we're asking them to evaluate, to create an expert committee, some people say, I was looking for who is going to be the campaigner, the champion of the people. That was not what we asked them to do. But this is how they approach. It's going to be a tax, it's going to be a pension from, I don't care, I want to see someone that takes care of the people. Or, this idea that it should be half-half. Let's put experts living in their bubble and real people living in the real world. Let's try to get every point of view. People in the real world have that expertise, have that knowledge. They're not experts in the traditional sense that perhaps we talk about. But it came time and time again. Or, better yet, the ideal, the flying unicorn of an expert who lives like us. We want, so politicians have Marie Antoinette syndrome. I like that. We need a poor expert, an expert who takes the metro, who buys bread, who with real life experience. So even if that's not the case, in most contexts, again, perhaps not the higher educated groups in these 4 countries, this idea that people that are politicians or experts, or the traditional experts, don't know. They don't live like them. They live in a different reality. And that discounts their ability to be an expert on the policy, on the issue. So this idea that representation matters, even when talking about very technical political issues, and an expert committee that is going to meet to discuss and we hadn't said anything about decision yet, so discuss and formulate recommendation for that. And again, this comes in also in the varieties of expertise. Even within the experts, people time and time again understood that you can't just have the same type. Like the understanding of complexity was very high, that you will by default make a mistake or miss something if you are not confronted with different points of view. So for example, in Italy, in some discussion saying that if the technocrats, speaking about the technical cabinets, had been confronted with other points of view, perhaps things would have been better for the long term. Or discussing about this, who would you like to see in an expert commission for pension reform, coming up with recommendations. I would like to see a pensioner. They know what it's like to be a pensioner. A young person who pays into the system, an economist, a statistician, competent people. So this idea that everybody needs to be heard, but also there's not one idea of an expert in terms of educational discipline or type, or you cannot just have economists only, or immunologists only, perhaps in the case of COVID. A lot of people mentioned COVID, and you needed some sociologists to understand what was going to happen in society. You needed some economists to understand what was going to happen to the businesses and to unemployment. So always like different varieties of experts. Finally, moving on to the profiles. Brace yourselves. We're looking for, so making profiles that were based ideally in real people. We try to make them as realistic as possible, while keeping them constant in the 4 countries, and manipulating the criteria that we wanted to facilitate discussion and to make some sense of the rankings. We went for 4 different profiles. One is academic, so very kind of highly educated academic background, but activist. So clear indication of where that person stands on the issue, either of climate change or of pension reform. The second one, now I'm changing a little bit the order. We have the academic but independent. So the main difference between these 2 profiles was that whereas education and perhaps professional experience are very, very similar, the affiliations create a big contrast. We have the alternative expert that we have named for lack of a better term. Perhaps you can come up with a better terminology, which is perhaps precisely this expert that comes more from lived experience, with not a high level of education, with also having lived experience, with a very clear indication of the kind of people that they have been associating with and background that they have. And here we also put a small level partisan affiliation, which we have changed as well in different groups and different countries to see if it makes a difference. Lastly, we have the consultant or business and finance consultant profile expert, which is again a more educated but more business oriented or finance oriented expert profile that we see the manager, this idea of public management, new public management. Let's bring the manager in to fix things. So this is an example of what the profiles looked in the UK for the case of the environment. So now they are in the order that you see above. First is the academic activist, alternative expert, academic independent, and consultant profiles. To point you in the direction, we have education, perhaps an affiliation where there's a very big contrast. The independent academic profile, Natural Environmental Research Council, British Geological Survey, and the likes, obviously PhD and professor backgrounds. And then already in the activist, we start seeing affiliations like task group leader for the IPCC, and then more trying to push it, Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace, quite obvious where they stand. But of course also PhD, a professor in very highly regarded institutions. The alternative profile at the diploma level, so not a university degree. In the case of environmental policy, we've put someone that has worked in food and agriculture. So farmers union, very active. So with experience and with a small, so in a regional level, association with some political party that needs to be also believable. Finally, again, a higher educated but more MBA style consultant, very, very experienced, again, with high levels of expertise, but associated with world leading institutions such as the World Economic Forum. We were very, very, very surprised. Maybe not if you are Swiss. Big backlash in Switzerland. We had to take it out at some point because that was all people saw in that profile. Didn't create a backlash in any other country, but the things you understand. So we have McKinsey type or Chamber of Commerce, so the associations that show a high level of experience, of expertise on the issue, but again, clearly on the side of, in this case, business. In the economy and for pension reform, again, it was more for the employer side. We had the independent profile. The alternative expert was someone that had worked with old people, so in care, in the care sector, and so more on that side. And the academic activist profile was very, very much involved in labor unions. So it was perhaps more left-wing, if you want to call it that way. So we tried to tweak as many things as we could. Images were computer generated. So people were primed to think that this might be, so what we said is like, you might know or might not know these people, it doesn't matter. And if they asked in the aftermath, though actually in the aftermath we told them that these were based in real profiles, but the pictures weren't computer generated. So the discussion was very much based in a not entirely hypothetical level, but also that these are not real people, that they couldn't track past track record, but the affiliations were signal enough. So, profile rankings and group results. This doesn't look pretty. Apologies for this at the moment. So, what I've done for the time being is to just have the country group. As you can see, you have whether it's the younger or older group, the education classification that we try to approximate, lower, medium, high, and then which topic each group discussed. We shifted things around all the time, so they're not that the, let's say, older, higher educated group always discussed environment or always discussed in every country. That limits a little bit our ability to make comparisons, but overall I think it's a more interesting, gives us overall picture. So, first impressions. This alternative profile is ranked, these are the rankings. Who should have led this expert committee? First place for who you think should lead it. Second place, who you think less so. Third and fourth, who you don't think should lead it. So higher numbers, higher evaluations, and lower numbers, lower evaluations. So this alternative profile, as you can see, is ranked second, and in some cases first in Switzerland and Sweden only, in those groups that we classified relatively lower levels of attained education, as opposed to less, so rankings further down the line in the higher educated groups. So already see some sort, it's not perfect, but what we see is like also in the discourse, it's evaluated differently, the way that people discuss about it. The overall rankings don't give you a lot of room to play with, but that's a first idea. In Sweden and Switzerland, actually, contrary to this expectation that perhaps there would be a more equally distributed or more heterogeneous ranking because of principles of more egalitarian a social structure, we do see quite a big preference for the academic profile, so the ones with the highest educational criteria, and even in Sweden, surprisingly, the activist, although the discourse at the beginning of the groups revealed a very high value placed on independence, it was not reflected, at least in the rankings, for the activist profile. So a little bit more mixed in Italy, where the academic activist seems to also perform very well. But I think so far we do find some differences in the two groups that we expected in the evaluation of the alternative expert profile. It's in line with the discussion towards that happened before we gave them the profiles. That is like, okay, there is a value placed in that kind of knowledge. There is, it is a dimension and forms a part of their evaluation of expertise. The academic profiles, at least one of the two always ranks in the first positions. So, of course, the academic activist profile is more controversial. And we found also that is more acceptable in the economic policy scenario than the environmental policy scenario. Perhaps because in the economic policy scenario, it is a very clear position on the people's side, and so probably the pensioner side, than perhaps the environment is more polarizing issue. For example, the only groups where the consultant ranks first is the older higher education groups that speak about the environment. And I think also knowing, having gone through these discussions, show that no, it's about economic. It's not about environmental protection. It's about sustainable economic models for those people. So yes, consultant profile overall is not evaluated very well in economic policy, but more positive in environmental policy scenario, where especially amongst the older groups, this idea that business interests or business needs to be incorporated and taken very seriously, even lead the discussion, is important. So some, again, very, very descriptive words about the alternative profile. For many, especially middle and higher educated groups, there's this idea that, yes, it's less knowledgeable, less prepared. That's more of an Italian way. Less authoritative. And for some, political affiliation was a minus. For others, especially the lower, classified as lower ed groups, is an emblem. It's a symbol of what a worker looks like.
Eri,
Yeah.
how are we doing for time? Are you close to wrapping up?
Yes.
Okay.
The consultant negatively, too much of the other side. This idea of sides, not on the side of the workers, of the people, too close to economic power, that's also a concern. Too many masters. This idea that it alienates someone. We still have to disentangle the mechanism behind this alienation. So is it the too many masters, or is it the too much on the other side? So is it the idea that it's not a representative, there is no descriptive representation, or is it actually substantive? He's going to do things I don't like. So older, lower educated groups discussing economic policy rank the alternative or activist profiles higher, potential evidence for motivated reasoning, because as I mentioned, the position of that profile was very, very strongly for the pensioner, the people. And whereas discourse in Sweden focused on experts that need to be independent as a source, like the independence was very, very important as a source of their trustworthiness and legitimacy. In the rankings, at least, we didn't see that reflected as a penalty given to the activist profile. One thing that we still need to do is to further investigate the homogeneity and heterogeneity within these groups, because now I just presented group rankings, but of course we have all the information at the individual level. I'm going to skip the conjoined experiment that we're trying to do. Also, it's not developed yet. So I would rather hear your ideas of how we can use these profiles, not the specific profiles, but these traits and what we got from the discussion to create survey experiments where we can test these differences and the difference evaluations in a more quantitative manner, where we can find significant differences and effect sizes, where what trait interacts with what to create that difference in perceptions of expertise and preference overall. So to summarize, it's very obvious to us that from the citizen's perspective, politically legitimate uses of expertise are contextual, largely in line with expectations at the comparative country level, with higher legitimacy found in Italy, more mixed in the UK, and lower, at least for decision making, in Switzerland and Sweden, with a caveat of very high legitimacy in the involvement in Sweden. There is also further space for contexts such as crises. A lot of people spoke about COVID-19, that it was okay. Some people mentioned war or the military cases where, that's it's expected to bring. It's legitimate to bring in the expert. Again, I mentioned Brexit before, featured a lot in conversations in the UK, both as a justification of higher willingness to accept, or in other cases, the lack of expert input during the referendum campaign. Who is assessed as an independent expert? We spoke about professional experience, knowledge, education, but at the same time, this, especially knowledge, has this dual concept. Independence or affiliation was the most contested criterion, often resulting in participants themselves calling out themselves as hypocrites and saying, okay, before we had this, or at the beginning of this discussion, I said it has to be independent, it shouldn't have affiliations, and then when they saw a profile they really liked and agree with, ranked them first and said, yes, I know I said that, but now I find that we really need that person. This is the right person. Can we observe systematic differences among the educational groups that we created? I think yes. We are still working on analyzing the discourses using qualitative software, but we already, I can tell you that there are differences when discussing knowledge, education, the idea of representation. When discussing expert profiles, so what traits are brought or highlighted, and especially the alternative expert profile. Some visibility in the rankings as well, and that's what I have for you. So I look forward for your comments. Thank you very much.